My name is Mauro Messina. I live in Palm City, and I am a veteran of World War II. I served in the South Pacific with the 13th Air Force, and I served overseas for close to 2.5 years, and since the war, I have joined the Veterans Association of the 13th Air Force, and I have been for 15 years now the historian for the 13th, because they were an abused Air Force during World War II, and nobody knows anything about the 13th Air Force, even though they were the most important and most destructive Air Force in the Pacific and in the Pacific War, and they're the ones that deprived Japan of its power and control in all three Pacific theaters and ended the Pacific War in June of 1944.
What college did you attend?
The college was Boston University, class of 1941, major journalism.
Did you finish? Oh, never mind. Hold on. You already answered that question. When you went overseas, did you expect to go into combat?
Yes, I did. I was trained as a radio man, and I expected to be assigned to a bomber because they had losses of bombers, and that would be one of the highest replacement needs of the replacement bureau that I was, center that I was in. And I fully expected to be assigned to a bomber, and instead they happened to need, had a call for a writer, and didn't have anybody to assign to the job until I arrived with my degree in journalism. So I was assigned, therefore, to Headquarter Squadron, 13th Air Force, for a job with the Awards and Decorations Department. And my first morning, after sleeping over the first time, I went to the mess hall for breakfast, and I found a sort of a crude newspaper that was there. And I went looking for the editor, and he was looking for somebody to replace him because he had been ordered to find somebody because they wanted him to work full-time on analyzing the target areas and the pictures that they had taken, because he was effective in guiding them and as to how to destroy the enemy targets more effectively. And they wanted him, and they told him to stop putting out the paper and concentrate on their needs, because that was more important. So when I came along and he found somebody able to take over the newspaper, we made a quick deal. I got out of Awards and Decorations, and that's how I began to take over the newspaper. And the newspaper was judged 6 months later by the Army News Service that was sending us the news every day by Morse code. And they conducted a contest with newspapers all around the world and in all the services, and they judged my newspaper, of which you've seen copies, as the best mimeographed newspaper in the armed services for 1944. And here I am, where the award was included a trophy cup, and the 13th Air Force, to get some publicity, had a general of the Air Force presenting the thing to me, and that's how this picture was taken. This is what I looked like in 1944, and the date, incidentally, which is June 26th, happened to coincide in later years with my son's wedding date, where he was married in 1976 after he got out of graduate school. So the date June 26th is significant to me for two reasons.
What would you say would probably be the most memorable thing that you ever wrote about?
Wrote about? Well, you mean during the war? Mm-hmm. Well, you see, a newspaper man doesn't create news. I have to take the news that I get and make sure that it's properly done, properly written, and that kind of thing, because being 10,000 miles away from home, the radio reception gobbled a lot of it, and we had to rewrite almost everything. But I didn't create any stories. I was really reporting it in the newspaper. So I can't answer your question in a manner that you're asking it.
So what would you say the most memorable thing you reported?
I didn't report
You,
because the paper was, I produced a paper with the news that was sent to me, and then we simply amplified and stuff with side stuff so that the paper looks more like a newspaper that you'd see at home, except it was done by a mimeograph machine, because that's the only printing media that we had. And the interesting thing was, another interesting thing, we only printed 1,100 copies, and we distributed them to units all around us in the island. But I was told later that the average number of readers of each page, each newspaper, was 25 people. In other words, when they distributed the papers, an average of 25 people read the paper after somebody put it down and reading it. Isn't it? So from 1,100 copies printed, the first 100 copies probably went to the generals and the big shots. So 25 times 1,000 is 25,000 readership of my newspaper. Every day, people were hungry for news. When you're 10,000 miles away, you want to know how the war's going. Are we winning? What kind of trouble are we getting? What's happening here? What's happening there? And everybody was hungry for news. And that's why every night we had a movie, because on the islands there's nothing else to do. You talk to people all day long, and so anyway, they had a movie, and even though most of the stuff was kind of junk, they hardly worth seeing, everybody went to the movie. So at the movie, before the movie started, I announced the news again, so that they have news about 12 hours after they read the first paper in the morning.
can you tell us a little bit about Yamamoto?
My alma mater, Boston University.
Oh no, can you tell us about Yamamoto?
Oh, Yamamoto, the admiral in command of the Japanese. Yes. The 13th Air Force was formed in January 13, 1943, but it didn't have a home base until we drove the Japanese off the island of Guadalcanal, which occurred the first week in February of 1943. And then after that, the Seabees went in and converted the island into a sophisticated forward base for America. We had no forward base. We fought for Guadalcanal. We drove the Japanese Navy out, but as far as controlling the island, we couldn't control it until we drove the Japs off the island, and that happened the first week in February of 1943. And after all of the Japs left the island, the Seabees came in and converted the island into a sophisticated forward base for America in the Pacific, in the South Pacific. Okay? Now, I say sophisticated because one of the problems we had was getting enough fuel for the planes that defended Guadalcanal. And what the Seabees were able to do was to put connections out into the bay, so that when the fuel ships came in, they, instead of loading it on pipes leading into the mainland, they were able to connect up to pipes coming up from the bay, and they filled our fuel supplies through that sophisticated system that the Seabees had constructed in the middle of the water.
But like textbooks today, they tell a different story.
Say it again?
Textbooks.
Textbooks, yes.
Do you agree with the stories they tell?
No. The Pacific War, as a historian, and I've been doing this for 15 years, Pacific War history is total fiction and deceit. Total. Okay? The Navy, well, you see, they had to hire a new historian. World War II was the world's first air war, so they needed a new historian to write the first air war. And this man proved to be an incompetent. Even though he's an Air Force person, he was an Air Force, he was a civilian hired to be the historian. And this occurred now right after the war ended, when they needed to start writing history about the war. And the Air Force had archives into which all of the history data was placed. But this man didn't base his history on archives. He based his history, because he was incompetent and a nitwit, he based it on communique data. And when he wrote history of the Pacific War, written by Halsey's communiques, who was more concerned with reporting the Pacific War as a Navy war, which it was not. Everybody today, 60 years later, because of this klutz of a historian, everybody today believes that the Pacific War, during the Pacific War, was a Navy war, when in fact it was really and honestly an air war. So the history of the Pacific War is fiction and deceit. The whole bit, all of it. It isn't real. Now, when the writers started writing the history book, volume 4 of a 7-volume set on World War II, and it's titled The Army Air Forces in World War II, edited by Craven and Kate. The history of the Pacific War that they wrote is not an honest presentation of the war, because the 13th Air Force, which was very important, is not even, it's a lost Air Force. Nobody knows the 13th Air Force even exists, for the most part. No libraries have any data. That's how fictitious the war is that this fellow wrote. And even though they show that the 13th participated here and there, it was not given the proper relationship of what the 13th Air Force did. And this is what I'm trying to correct now, and I'm not sure how many years I've got to do it in.
Did you have any close friends or relatives that were in the war that you ever?
Well, my brother was in the war. He came out alive. He was 6 years younger than I, so he made it through, but he didn't arrive there until about December of '44 for the last 6 months of the war. He was a veteran. He was a machine gunner in the infantry, but he was early high school when or less than that, when I was in the Army, 6 years younger.
Now, were you married at the time that you?
In the Army? No. I got married within 6 weeks after I got home. I got out of the Army December 2nd, 1945. I hadn't seen my wife-to-be, my fiancée. I gave her a ring in June of 1943, and I didn't see her again until December 2nd, 1945. We were married 6 weeks later because they couldn't predict when I would come out. So therefore, they had to start after after 2.5 years away, apart. We were strangers. We almost didn't know whether we should get married because we didn't know each other. But we agreed to marry. We had vowed ourselves to each other, and the family then had to begin finding, the church, the place to have the reception, and all of the details that go with it. So we were married. I first saw her December 2nd. January 13th, we were married. Where do you go on a honeymoon? So we went to New York City for a week. I had already applied to graduate school, and we got back on a Sunday night. Monday morning, I started graduate school, Boston University again.
What will you remember most about the war?
You see, I've been historian for 15 years, and there's so much. The thing that I remember the most is the poor history of the 13th Air Force, which nobody knows because it's a lost Air Force. Nobody knows the 13th Air Force existed. Libraries have no data. So to me, that is not the best, but that is foremost in my mind, the abuse of the history of the 13th Air Force, even though it was the dominant Air Force in the Pacific War that destroyed the power and the control of the Japanese in all 3 theaters because the other air forces lacked the destruction skills that we acquired.
How long did you say you were writing newspapers for again?
When that picture was, this picture,
Mm-hmm.
I'm 23 years old. My birthday is in August, so this is June 26, 1944. I'm still only 23 years old. And I was 23 when I produced the papers that won the prize.
Okay.
Okay? The best mimeographed newspaper in the armed services. Holy cow.
Do you have, like,
I had no idea there was going to be a contest.
were you surprised when you won?
Totally. I didn't, as I say, you know, you're putting out a newspaper and you didn't really, no one knew that there was going to be a contest where everybody was obliged to send in samples of their paper. And have mine, the best mimeographed newspaper. I must have learned a lot in journalism school. But you see, well, the fact that I was a writer saved my life because I had been trained for combat. I was expecting to be a radio man, probably on a bomber. I'd be a gunner, and the possibility of making it through the war was, in my eyes, kind of slim. So when I was assigned as a writer, and I become a non-combat soldier, I have to tell you, I looked up to heaven and thanked God many times.
You said you published newsletters after the war.
Yes.
What were some of the best stories told through these
Those
newsletters?
are good, yeah. Well, one of the interesting ones was the lone bomber of Rabaul. And it turned out that this pilot was asked to, he just went along with his commander to Treasury Island, one of the islands that bombers used to go off and attack Rabaul. Rabaul was Japan's largest, most massive island in the entire Pacific War. It was also the forward base of its very critical logistics system. It had a support base in Truk in the Caroline Islands, 600 miles east. But Rabaul was the biggest and most important base in the entire Pacific. It was headquarters for Admiral Yamamoto, nobody knows that he had started a campaign to take over the continent of Australia. And the Navy cryptographers had broken the Japanese codes, and they informed the Navy, and the Navy, this is now May 1942, 5 months, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, and during the Battle of the Coral Sea, they drove back home to Rabaul the convoy that was on its way to Port Moresby on New Guinea in order to begin the campaign for taking over control of the Australian continent. Nobody knows that was happening, but when I studied the thing and I analyzed what was going on, that was what the intent was of this huge convoy that was turned back to Rabaul by the Navy during the Battle of the Coral Sea, May 1942. What else? Another important event was the killing of Admiral Yamamoto on April 18, 1944. No, 43. April 18, 1943, a year before. And when our guys traveled the way they did to get to where he was supposed to be, the reason we knew where Admiral Yamamoto was going to be was because the cryptographers had broken the Japanese radio codes. They knew where the admiral and his staff were going to be, and their two bombers were protected by 6 Japanese Zero fighters, and by chance, our fighters that went up to intercept and try to shoot down the admiral succeeded in arriving as they had planned, as they hoped to have planned. The group of planes coming from Rabaul with Admiral Yamamoto, and just by chance they happened to coincide, and that's how we were able to kill Admiral Yamamoto and his staff. That was a big event, so that story was a big one.
Do you believe that America should have gotten involved in the war?
World War II?
Yes.
Oh, sure. if somebody hits you in the eye, are you going to stand there and take it, or you're going to run? You have to fight. That's the way I look at things.
Okay.
So, and I'm a little guy, so anybody hits me, I got to go after them. So anyway, sure, Japanese, look at the mess they made at Pearl Harbor. We had no alternative but to go into the war. And we were already into the European war, and we in the Pacific got dribs and drabs for I'd say 6 to 8 months, because all of the production of the American production system was first priority to Europe, to take care of the Hitler and see that they were supplied. The Navy, after the damage done by the Japs at Pearl Harbor, also had first priority on the American production system. So they got all the ships and planes that they needed, and we in the Army got dribs and drabs. We didn't have enough planes to fight. The airplanes that went up and killed Admiral Yamamoto were P-38 fighter planes with twin engines. Magnificent plane, the best plane we had throughout the war. But we only had, on the date that we killed Yamamoto, April 18, 1943, we only had 24 of the P-38s. All of the other planes were junk. We had P-39s and P-40s. We had P-400s that had no oxygen, so they were no good above 12,000 feet. The P-39s had an oxygen system that was not too much good, and above 17,000 feet they were no good. And the P-40s went up to 19,000 feet, and above that they were no good. Only the P-38s had a decent system. And we didn't get, as I say, by the time we killed Yamamoto on April 18, 1943, we had a total of 24 planes. That's all they gave us, because the rest of them went over to Europe.
Were you ever wounded at all?
No, I was in a non-combat soldier with Headquarter Squadron. They were never we were bombed. I have to say that when we got to the Dutch East Indies island of Mauritania, we had, an average of three air raids a night, where they dropped bombs all around us. And we had to go into foxholes for 30 minutes at a time, and bombs came close, because a salvo of bombs was right outside where the foxhole that I was in, and it blew up a building where the post office was located. And one of the guys said, "Oh boy, it feels like somebody's arm," he said, and it turned out to be a roll of newspaper, but it rolled into the opening. There were like 10 or 12 guys in each foxhole, and they were covered over because our own flak was coming down on us. And so when it hit the post office building, something flew into the end of the tent. He felt it. He said, "It feels like somebody's arm or leg," he said, but it turned out to be a roll of newspapers. So that was interesting. But the worst experience we had were the bombs coming down for about close to 4 months, four full months, on Mauritania and the Dutch East Indies. And an interesting thing there was, one of the guys that was under the post office, all the buildings are up on posts about maybe 2 feet at the most above the ground. And guys that couldn't find a foxhole would roll in under those to get away from the flak coming down. So there were 3 or 4 guys that got hurt when this post office was damaged. And we, in the foxhole, because we were nearest to them, went in and helped to lift up the debris and try to get the guys out. Well, one of the guys was so bad that he had to go home, and he spent 8 months in San Francisco at Letterman General Hospital there, which was a military-connected base. And the interesting thing about that was, I didn't know this guy, this fellow that got hurt. But 13 years later, my son was 3 years old, and he's playing with a boy in a house in the back, and he's another 3-year-old boy, and my wife Mary and this kid's mother got to know each other, got to talk to each other, and they invited us over for dinner one Saturday, not for dinner, just for get together one Saturday night. And as we entered the house, this a fellow that was an uncle to the boy that my son played with started asking questions. He said, "Were you in the war?" I said, "Yeah, I was in the Pacific." And he said, "Oh, so was I." I said, yeah, I was, anyway, we arrived at the point that we were in the same 13th Air Force together, and he was the guy that got damaged the most under the thing and went to 8 months in the hospital in San Francisco. And this, he's the uncle of the boy that my boy played with, which I thought was interesting. And then we got together and started talking, and he got so excited at the fact that I was in the foxhole and helped to get him out. So that's an interesting experience right there. Oh, there's so many stories. They never stop.
What was the greatest thing that happened to you during the World War II?
What's the greatest thing that happened to me? I think probably this event right here. Because, you know, in Headquarter Squadron, you have a job to do. And my job is to put out the newspaper and to announce the news, okay? And other than that, I slept. We had fierce rainstorms like you wouldn't believe. But anyway, what was I trying to tell you? So things get boring, and so when an opportunity came up for me to do my job, which was to announce the news, inform the people, and one of the interesting things that happened there was the war. The Japs had surrendered, and in the 2 weeks or so before they signed the armistice, news started to come in about what things were going to be like after we guys got home. And so one of the stories that came in was a story about how the U.S. Employment Service had notified all branches of the U.S. Employment Services to the effect that if one job was applicable to an officer and enlisted man, and they both had the same qualifications, and the job was first to be offered to the officer, according to this directive to the U.S. employment officers, because he and his family had become accustomed to a higher standard of living. Well, I held this story out. We had a USO show, so I'm on the stage in the front, and I saved this story to last, and when I spoke then, there's another aspect to this. Headquarter Squadron was operated mostly by highly educated enlisted men, because some of the officers had gotten their commissions back in 1939 and 40 before at a time when the military needed officers, and so anybody that had an IQ of 110 was automatically almost forced to go to OCS. So a lot of these guys got commissions, and some of them were just, in work experience, with checkout clerks at a Piggly Wiggly store or something. So a lot of the guys lost respect for some of the officers because they lacked ability. And these guys that ran and did the work and operated the Headquarters Squadron were college graduates, and often many of them had graduate degrees. So when you get this gap of education between the enlisted men and the officers, and you have to take orders from the officers, there's a lack of respect there. So anyway, when I read this story, I'm on the stage now, and there's this huge area, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 soldiers to come to see the movie, and the center section back was all filled with officers. They had certain privileges. So all around them, and maybe 3,500 guys, were all enlisted men. And when they heard that story, the comment, it paused maybe for 60 seconds, or 30 seconds, 60 seconds. And then the comments that came, I can't repeat them here. So anyway, when I started to put the newspaper out after the movie, the colonel, I had a full bird colonel in charge of my section, Jordan L. Larson, I remember his name. he sent the major over, not the captain or the lieutenant, but the major this time. And I was ordered not to publish the story. I had never been censored once. Not once did I ever been censored. All of a sudden, I said, the order came, I was not to publish that story. And any story that came through from now on that might affect the morale of the organization was not to be published, and the decision for making that, this person to make that decision was me. And so if I printed anything that was going to affect the morale of the organization, it would be my head. I thought that was interesting because I had never been censored.
You said you were stationed in the South Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like there?
Oh, God. First of all, the climate is, you can't believe it. The rainy seasons and the rains come down like they're pouring out of a pitcher. The climate and the bugs, you can't imagine the insects and stuff. And they're serious. In the beginning, there wasn't any screening to eat. There's no screening for the tents. The tents never had a floor. You're sleeping on a cot, and I'm not a big guy, and I couldn't fit on the cot. My shoulders would be rubbing against the wooden part of it. You don't sleep well, you don't eat well. The food was so bad. It was all powdered food, powdered milk, powdered eggs, powdered juice, powdered everything. And it was just a misery. And then the malaria. I was in the hospital 3 times with malaria, so I still have it. I had attacks for about, after I got home, for maybe 8 or 10 years occasionally, not serious ones, because I never, I had a light case where the children, in fact, within 3 weeks after I got married, and I had never mentioned this to my wife, my new wife, and one night after a few weeks of marriage, I got the chills about around midnight, and I spoke to her and I said, "Will you get my army overcoat?" She said, "I'm shivering like you can't believe." And so she got the army overcoat and wondered what was happening to me. And I had to tell her, that this is malaria. And then about 4 or 5 minutes later, I said to her, "Will you pull that 4x6 rug off the floor and throw it over the overcoat?" And to hear her tell the story to her friends, because she wasn't aware of this condition I had, was amusing to me. But the point is, I never was not able to go to work the following morning. I'd sweat and I'd be hot and cold all through the night until I went to sleep, and then by the time I got up in the morning, I was ready to go to work, and I never lost a day's work because of an attack. So it was a light case, because I saw guys in the hospital when I was there who had lost 20, 30 pounds. They were skinny, and they had what they call brain malaria. That was the expression we used to differentiate between the light type that I had and this. I was also in the hospital for dysentery. There was a time when the hot water that we used to clean our mess gear with, they had toilet bowl brushes that we cleaned the mess gear with. And when the water wasn't hot enough, it left a coating of grease on the surface of the metal mess gear. And that got me in the hospital with dysentery, and I spent 11 days. And the only medication they had in 43 was sulfur pills. And they were about as big as my thumbnail here. We had to take them 6 times a day, but I finally got over it, and that was another experience. It was bad, but I was very lucky. I didn't catch any diseases, or they used to force us to take Attabrin to stop supposedly to stop the malaria. But when the mosquitoes bite you, you don't know whether they have it or not. Most of them had it, and so we took those 3 times a day, and they checked to see that everybody took one. Well, after a couple of years, my skin got sort of a gray color, orange color, and when I got home, it took me the best part of a year before I lost the color. Because I was that kind of, And it didn't stop the malaria, because I still got it.
Were you in the center of action?
Say it again?
Were you in the center of the action in the South Pacific?
No. I was in a back squadron. I was in Headquarter Squadron of the 13th Air Force, and the planes were even more forward than we were. No, I was not in the forward action. Thank God. And I really pray to God. I have to tell you. Let me tell you, when your life is in jeopardy, you pray. Just like I prayed for an education. I'm the son of an immigrant shoemaker. I knew it needed an education. I didn't know where the money was coming from because I started college in the middle of the greatest depression the world had ever known. So I prayed for God then, and God has been good to me. All up to now, because I have 2 wonderful children. Both have graduate degrees. Their spouses have graduate degrees. My daughter did well. My son did well. My son is a senior vice president of Bank of America today. He spent 18 months in Asia, and he just got back less than a month ago. So God has been good to me.
What does Pacific Theater mean?
It means all of the waters of the Pacific Ocean between the Philippine Islands and the Pacific Islands, such as the Carolines and the Marshall Islands. There's an area where it's the Pacific, and after the Pacific War, it was over. There were no enemy. The Japanese lost control and power in all of the Pacific areas. Nimitz then began to take islands in the area south of the Pacific. I forget what they call that region, but they immediately, and we helped them take it, took the islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam because they needed bases for the B-29s that were about to start bombing Japan, and that's when Japan became a flame. The whole island was, wherever we attacked, they left the island in flames. It was so bad. And of course the B-29s also dropped the atom bombs back in early August of 1945. Thank God they did, because we were all set. The date had been established of November 1st for landing troops that were sent over from Europe and the army and the troops that we had there in the Pacific, and they were supposed to land on the Japanese islands August 1st, 1945.
Okay, what kind of battles went on in the South Pacific?
Say it again?
What kind of battles?
Yeah.
Battles?
Yeah. What were they like?
Well, the interesting thing about that is most of the time we didn't have to use land troops, only on certain occasions when we wanted to take an island because we wanted to put an air base on it. The first, in the South Pacific, the first islands we took, we used land troops. And we took the Russell Islands because we wanted to put an air base there. But the biggest battle was Munda in the South Pacific. And they made a mistake there because they learned from the Munda battle that they didn't have to kill every Jap on the island. All they had to do was stop the supplies from reaching these troops, and they would be totally ineffectual. But they learned the lesson because they did go after all the troops on Munda so that they could build the air base there and not have any trouble with the Japs after that. But they had to learn that lesson that hard way. After that, most of the islands we took, we just stopped the supplies of food and supplies from getting to the Japs, and they were out of action.
When you came back to the U.S., what did you do?
My work, I was, in journalism, I was expected to be a reporter first. And I decided, even during the war, that I really didn't like reporting. I like a scheduled life. So I decided not to be a reporter because I had been invited. I had also won a prize from the New York Newspaper Guild, which is the group in New York City where you go to if you're looking for a job in the newspaper field in the New York area. That was the New York Newspaper Guild. So they invited me because they gave me a first prize in news writing along with the prize that I got here. And they invited me to come, but I decided not to stop in because I wasn't interested in being a reporter. And I then decided to go into advertising agency work. And I did that for 5 years. And one of the clients that I got work for, to write for, was this company that I finally joined up and stayed with for 33 years. They were in the clothing industry. They sold automatic and automatic machines to the clothing industry. And it turned out that they liked my writing because most of the people over they were founded in 1881, and they had trouble finding people who knew how to write to the clothing industry. And I seemed to have some sort of an instinctive, something about me instinctively that was able to write to the industry. So they were impressed by it. And I wondered myself how I came to have it. But my father and my grandfather, and probably before him, were shoemakers. They used needle and thread to make shoes by hand. My mother's family, my mother's father was a tailor. So in all probability, there were tailors in that family. So there was needle and thread apparently in my genes. And this is how I felt very comfortable, and I had a comprehension of what the needle trades were about. So anyway, 5 years later, the company that I told you I was writing for offered me a job, and I took it, and I stayed with them for 33 years. I was a product marketing manager. I was responsible for product. And one of the products was interesting because it was, I was responsible for applying ultrasonics to the fabrication of clothing. And at the Bobbin Show, the big international show in Atlanta every year, for 1984, I had 11 different applications of ultrasonics as applied, and it was a fascinating thing. I don't want to go into too much detail, but people were 4 and 5 deep at the outside looking at me and the other guys making samples with an ultrasonic machine suitable for clothing. I've had a very interesting life.
Yeah.
And then, as I say, that part of my life was fascinating, and I got a lot of attention from it because nobody else knew what I knew about ultrasonics and the clothing industry. And here I am again. Nobody knows what I know about the Pacific War. Okay? So I've had a very interesting life. And God has been good to me with my children. I have 2 kids, graduate degrees, house spouses. My son is a senior vice president, Bank of America. My grandchildren are mostly all college graduates except one that's going to a private school, and she will be a college graduate. I have a granddaughter who's a sophomore this year at Smith College, and she's bright as a button. And she's majoring in medicine, biology, and she's got a pre-med program. So God has been good. I have to tell you. So if you girls want something, pray.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you for your time. We appreciated your interview. Thank you for your time. We appreciated your interview.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome. It's a delight.